Hello, everyone. This is our recording for the end of week 3 of Working Lives in the Railways, and we'll cover week 2 as well. And then hopefully sometime end of next week, beginning of the week after, we'll do a kind of final wrap-up recording for your week 4 comments and feedback. Again, brilliant to have a really lively group of people commenting and interacting. Thanks so much for all the links and extra reading you're providing. It's great that you're following up, and that's exactly what these courses are designed to help you to do. As we said before, of course, all of that is optional. This is a very introductory course where we just try and whet your appetite, so that if you want to go away and explore the wider world of railway labour, you can do so. And in week 4 there will be more tools and suggestions and further reading lists and so forth, so you can do that afterwards if you wish. So because I've got Ollie here, and I've been through the comments, Ollie, by the way, has a very small baby, so we're very pleased he's able to join us, but that's why he's not able to be as active in the comments as I am on this particular run. Yeah, can we feature the baby in the final live stream, Ollie?
Absolutely.
in a tiny railway outfit.
Tiny railway outfit. I'll have a look.
That's what we need here. But yes, so I'm registering your questions, the ones that require a proper railway expert to answer, to pass on to Ollie here. So this will mostly be me asking him. So let's go back to Signalman. There was a really great range of comments. It was good to see everyone being so interested in the signalman's or signal person's life. So we had a few specific and some more general comments. One was about the number of signalmen in the box, which did vary, didn't it, Ollie?
It did. So Borough Market that you saw us filming inside, I think we say in the video it's a train every 6 seconds that's passing through Borough Market. So there are a team of them in there. I don't think we managed to show you on the video, but there's a sort of small toilet bathroom in the signal box. There's a little area for sort of almost like a kitchenette for sort of staff to use. So it was quite a busy location. Some of the ones that oversaw big junctions really did have, so you have a signaller for each bank of lever arches which were controlling particular points along the route, but smaller ones could just be one person in a box. That very isolated experience that we were talking about and that you saw in some of the historical sources that we linked.
Yeah, and everybody was really enjoying Dickens's The Signalman as well. Yeah, which really plays off that perception of the lonely signaller.
Yes, it wouldn't have worked if there'd been a team of 6 of them seeing ghosts down in the cutting, would it? So, no. Or it would have been a very different story, I think.
Not quite so atmospheric.
No.
And then we had a few questions about women in signal boxes, and Hamish left a great comment about possibly the only Victorian signal woman, Mrs. Tars. So we're seeing if we can track down the article he'd sourced in the Railway magazine. Incidentally, just to note, some of your links we can't incorporate in the course links because this is an international course, and FutureLearn wants every link to be accessible from every country in the world, everyone, everywhere. So that does limit us to a certain extent, but we'll try and find this because it's a great story. But she was maybe the only woman working in the signals. Do you know when women started to move into that profession more broadly?
Oh, so I'm always really dubious when we talk about like the only or the first or there's always, I always say something like this and then I'll have someone in the museum who's actually got, the first railway cat or the first railway sort of accident portfolio piece or something. So I'm very wary about saying this. I should think that there are earlier women, particularly working on sort of rural stations where there's very limited traffic. We know that there were women crossing guards, which was sort of a similar job to the signaller in some ways, because it was about sort of maintaining the flow of traffic. I mean, that's about road traffic crossing the railway line. But I should think there would have been a lot of crossover between those jobs in very rural stations where it was, all hands to the pump from a very limited team at particular times during the day. If you're talking about the sort of big national picture, really women are only entering the signal box in big numbers during the Second World War. So during the First World War, they are largely kept at arm's length from the signal box. It's deemed one of those highly skilled, highly pressured environments that women would just not be suitable to by the sort of powers that be within the railways. The situation's more drastic during the Second World War. There's more manpower shortages on the railway, so women are just put into the signal box. And attitudes have started to change about women and difficult work and heavy machinery in that period as well. After the war, obviously there's a pushback. Most of those women then leave the railway, but there are some who stay on, and the British Railways, sort of nationalised railways, starts to really get into hiring female signallers as just part of the course. In the early 1960s is when you start to see them regularly appear on sort of staff lists and magazines and things.
Yeah, and it is always important to remember, isn't it, that in the Victorian period, it's not just that women were deemed physically incapable of some jobs, it's that they were deemed kind of physiologically and mentally, and those weren't really separated for the Victorians, incapable, in that it was just widely felt that women could not cope with an extremely stressful occupation.
It's that great Victorian catch-all word of temperament. They don't have the right temperament. Sorry,
temperament. Yeah.
Yes, temperament. Temperance is also very important when you're working in a signal box, as we discussed in the course. But yeah, the idea that women would not cope with the emotional strain of the signal, which, as we've seen in the James Holmes sort of case that we put up there, the Thirsk rail crash. You know, emotion and being overcome in the signal box is something that men were completely susceptible to as well. But as Kirstie says, this, you know, the physical and the mental and the sort of psychological were all part and parcel for the sort of organisers and managers in the 19th century. Yeah,
but as in the Thirsk crash, this was discussed in the comments as well, actually, men were supposed to be able to manage their emotions. Even if your child had died, you were assumed to be capable of doing a dangerous job, because you'd be able to kind of, suppress that successfully. It's really interesting. Let's see, how long were signallers' shifts was a question that a few people asked.
So this changes over the period, and railway workers, and particularly signallers, are part of that big movement towards first the 10-hour day and then the 8-hour day. These are big sort of labour causes across Britain, across the world, actually. So originally they would have been doing 12-hour shifts. Holmes, I think, talks about a 10-hour shift in his work, and multiple, sometimes several back to back, and then a sort of 2-on 1-off structure as well, which must have been incredibly grueling. By the end of the century, that's been hammered down. The union pressure has pushed it down to sort of 8 hours, but also the signallers are very, very good at using cases like Holmes to sort of campaign for shorter hours. I mean, Holmes, when he's acquitted from the trial, then goes on a sort of speaking tour as a sort of minor celebrity around Britain, saying, well, this is why you need to sort of have better systems for limiting the hours, for having backup signallers in the case of a problem, because the travelling public's lives are in our hands, and if we're too tired to do the job, then look at what can happen. So they were able to play on people's sort of anxieties about railway accidents in this period quite effectively to limit the sort of hours coming in.
We've got that great Inspector Aitken poem about the signaller who takes on an extra shift in the goods yard, remember, and then causes an accident as well, which was about moonlighting in different kinds of jobs to get more pay and then going to your shift. Okay, let's see, pay for signalmen. Pay, I should say, is an issue that we do get asked about a lot, and we sort of slither out of it because it's such a complicated issue. But since a number of people have asked, we'll try and dig up the information that I know we've got on this and talk about it at the end of the course in a comparative way. But signalmen were paid considerably less than our week one engine drivers, weren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, more than sort of porters and guards, who were the sort of lowest of the low on the railways, but not a huge amount more, and certainly not commensurate. There was lots of great comments about, were these people skilled? A lot of debate about, was this a skilled profession? Certainly not in the eyes of the people doing the paying.
Yeah.
would be what I'd say.
Yeah, which is
So
a good.
yeah, I think it'd be really useful to in the final week's video to sort of put them all side by side.
Yeah,
And try and talk about that.
Yeah, and talk about the standards of life you could have on a railway pay and what it would cover in the period. We'll see what we can do on that. A lot of people interested in training and in how signalmen were recruited. Two questions that perhaps go together.
I think it's nice that we've had this discussion about temperaments now, because actually this is probably what governed recruiting people, was your sense, and hirer's sense of whether you were the right person rather than any sort of qualification or formal training. There would have been a period of training, presumably done largely on the job, a bit like the engine drivers actually probably shadowing an experienced signaller in the box and understanding what different levers did, and different technologies. So as our period goes on, we talked about this, the sort of interlocking and these different systems that are designed as sort of fail safes to stop you pulling the wrong lever and causing an accident, and the sort of block system which allows trains, only one train into a section of track at any one time. Probably those are all learned shadowing. I should think there was very, as far as I can tell from the records, there's very minimal formal training before the 20th century.
So if
We've
you're,
got,
if you're keen, if you're a keen young porter and you want to make it as a signalman, you would just try and get yourself noticed as reliable and steady and
and having a good pair of eyes and being able to sort of stay awake for an 8-hour shift in the box and things like that. In the museum, we've got an enormous sort of table layout that looks a little bit like a model railway, but actually what it is, it's a working signal demonstration training tool. But that was built in, I think, 1912, and this was very much a 20th century. And I think we talked about this in the Drivers' Week as well, that as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, formal education, training courses, written sort of instructions became much, much more part of the railways, and across all sorts of different types of work on the railways.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was most of the signalman questions, though. Keep them coming in. We'll go back through and keep an eye on that week in case there's things we haven't covered. So I know people are still catching up on the navies. Again, we'll come back and have a look at that. But we did have some interesting questions. Let's see. There was quite a bit of interest in navi camps, how they were managed, how they were fed, what provision for them was made. Did they just, I think the overall question is, did navies just show up and fend for themselves, or to what extent were these kind of managed communities with healthcare and food and such like provided?
Yeah, I mean, I love talking about navies, and we could talk about navies for absolutely ages, but I promised Kirstie I'll try and keep this brief. So navi camps are, when you see them described, and they're usually described, and we talked about this, I think, in the court, they're usually described by a middle-class outsider, often a parish priest who happens to see this railway being built across the bottom of his parish, or a journalist, or a sort of charity worker. They're almost described as these sort of organic things that have grown up out of the soil with, and obviously they weren't, they were sort of people who descended onto the works. They were mustered by these big factors. And I think we talk about Peto and Betts, these big factors, factor men who worked with Brunel, Stevenson, these group men who sort of could summon up. And I think there's this brilliant bit that I think we did link in the course about where they're asked in the sort of parliamentary committee, how many men have you got? And he says, well, something like 10,000 men working at all sites across the country at any given moment. It's all run through a system of middle managers all the way down. I think it probably depended on the type of work and probably how interested your employer was in your welfare. So some navi work, when it's particularly close to towns and villages, they're just housed in the local town and the local village. And we know this through usually newspaper reports of the sort of fracas in the streets from various groups of navies beating 7 shades of unmentionable out of each other in the street at night and getting drunk. if it's more exposed routes, so the sort of, I think they included the picture of the Settle and Carlisle Navy camp, the sort of up in the Yorkshire moors. That one was, the employers brought more material up to them as well. Often the employers would arrange for things like merchant wagons to come up and sell to the navvies. There was a lot of anxiety in the navvy camps about whether they were being shortchanged, you know, whether their employer and the merchant were fixing the prices of things like bread before they arrived, because this was the only option they had for buying. Yeah. There were also lots of home comforts brought up by missionary societies, and charitable societies would trek up into the sort of hinterlands to bring sort of usually things like newspapers and religious tracts up to the navvies there, but also help them set up things. So on the Settle and Carlisle, where they're there for quite a while building the railway and the viaduct, there's a school, there's a chapel, there's streets, and the settlements have different names as well. So there are quite established ones, and there's been some very interesting archaeology in recent years trying to sort of uncover the remnants of these camps around the country. Yeah. I think people asked about women in the navvy camps as well.
Yeah, because when you say school, it implies, you know, a whole family setup, rather than all these young men on their own.
Yeah, I mean, someone I think asked whether it would be like the armies of the 19th century, which had sort of semi-formalized women who sort of followed them around. It wouldn't have been as formal as that. I think it would have been wives and female relations and mothers, I think, for younger men who might have followed them up there and sort of set up shop with them up on the sort of camps and things. Yeah, I think it's much more informal, but there were widely understood to be sort of families living up on the sort of moors and things for these navvy camps. The navvy camps are not there long enough to capture with the census. A number of people were sort of suggesting
about that.
Yeah, I mean, the census has been so invaluable for family history and working class history, but I just don't think it's almost impossible to capture navvies, partly because very few census recording officers wanted to trek up to these remote navvy camps with a sort of huge sheath of papers and do the recording there as well. So they occasionally pop up, particularly when they're close to towns, particularly when they're putting railways through London, for example, that you can sometimes glimpse a navvy or two, but you wouldn't get navvies usually on the census, unfortunately.
There's lots of different ways you can be described on the census as well. So one very common one is just labourer.
Yes.
And, you know, so you could be a labourer who is a navvy on the railways, or you could be a labourer in any wide variety of works.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can't always tell if you're a railway employee.
No, and a lot of navvies would have been, as we talked about, young farm workers in the down season. So might have described themselves as farm labourers, even when they happen to be up on the navvy camps.
Yeah.
Which they see. I mean, someone I think asked, is this part of the, you know, is this the sort of 19th century gig economy?
Yeah.
And it is a little bit, but it also goes back to those centuries old tradition of the agricultural year. So you build in the town during the winter months because that's when you need the least amount of manpower out on the fields.
Yeah.
So, you know, and that's something that vanishes in the second half of the 19th century, is that ebb and flow of men between agriculture and construction projects.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting workforce because it's a migrant workforce in that you've got all these people coming from Europe and further afield, and especially across from Ireland, down from the Highlands of Scotland. But you also have local people, and then you also have people who are sort of local but might have migrated 10, 20 miles away from their farm and are actually either living in the navvy camp or walking back and forward. And in the newspaper article I think we have that's describing one of those, you know, street brawls, a lot of people were saying in the comments, well, is this just like football hooliganism, or this is just the kind of standard? But actually the way these things are reported does make it seem like it's a dangerous immigrants in our midst narrative happening, which is slightly different from it's just the local youth kind of kicking off.
Yeah.
As it happens, because I was doing a talk for the Devil's Porridge Museum in Gretna this week, and this is the World War I munitions factory that was built by an army of, it was 15,000 navvies descended on the town and built an entire sort of factory complex and several villages and lodging houses very, very fast. And the curator there, Judith, was saying that they've got nothing belonging to them, and that in the basement of one of the houses, you know, when excavations were being done, they found, I think, some tools, maybe a pair of boots, and that's all they've got to kind of show that these people existed. But they left a substantial trace in the local press because it's absolutely full of ministers in a panic complaining about drinking and rioting on Sundays and the morals of the neighborhood going downhill and innocent maidens being corrupted and so forth. So what you're saying about the outsider perspective, it's just really true everywhere. We did have other questions about female navies. It's interesting in the section on the female navy that a lot of people were sort of saying, well, of course women could have done these jobs, and, you know, yeah, we're happy to accept they were there. This is kind of back to what I was just saying about women in the signal box. Definitely women could do all these jobs, physically speaking, but culturally speaking, there's such a huge stigma about certain kinds of labor that it would be very, very difficult for a woman to be accepted as one of the boys in a Victorian navvy camp. There is that one female Glasgow navvy, isn't there? Who was the old lady? She was I've forgotten her name. But she was an elderly woman. She was a character, and she worked in kind of brickworks and such like, and Clydeside, which is the kind of thing you could get away with. You were a big, tough, older working class woman. If you were a young woman, I really think that a navvy camp would have been a very dangerous place for you to be. And if you think about the proximity in which people lived, it would have been quite hard to disguise the fact that you were not a man for a substantial period of time. So I feel slightly dubious about the female navvy stories. There's a lot of them. And they're unprovable, but yeah.
I think it's very, very hard, and I think it's doubly hard in that employers who found out would have also been very keen to remove female navvies very, very quickly from camps as well, because of the sort of potential for disruption that they would have seen within the workforce as well. So I think you would have had all sorts of, as Kirstie says, sort of dangers, but also hostilities from sort of managers and people who would believe they were acting in the woman's best interest in removing her from that situation.
Yeah. I mean, of course, you could be, you know, the girlfriend of one of the navvies, and you've sneaked up to spend a few weeks with them, and easy to picture. But to actually be one of the team as a woman, much harder to imagine.
I think it's very hard as well, because I think a lot like when we were talking about female signallers in rural stations where people would just pitch in, I should imagine at camps there were occasions where the women in the camps might have done some of the work, but I think that would have been viewed as exceptional. It would have been viewed as something not to be regularly repeated. And I mean, this is the universal truth about women working in sort of this period in these sort of industries, is I doubt they would have been paid for it.
Yeah. Yes.
A bit like women working in agriculture, where they were sort of often just assumed to be doing it because they were pitching in to help fathers or brothers or husbands on the farm.
Yeah.
And that was their reward rather than their own wage packet themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we had some great comments in the last step about how people would find the navvies, most of which were correct. You know, when people were talking about local archives and records you could search, and museums and so forth, it's all correct. I guess the interesting question to think about is, how long would it take, and how large an army of volunteers would we need to have to significantly revise navvy history by finding enough materials to do that? And it's not as though, you know, museums aren't keen to find those materials where they could. And we did one interesting question about photography and whether there was any kind of archive of photographs of the navvies, because there was for a period a kind of fashion among some famous photographers of taking photos of working people, like the fisherwoman Scottish Fisherwomen or the Lancashire Mill Lasses immediately come to mind as two groups where we've got a photographic record, but that's not true of the navvies as far as I know. Is it, Ollie?
I can't think of any in Britain. So you did get photographers who followed the American railways west, but their interest was in sort of capturing an industry. So they would picture the sort of workers, and this is where you get a lot of the very interesting pictures of Chinese migrants working on the 19th century railways in America. And that's a very sort of different but very interesting navvy story in America. But I can't think of any equivalents in Britain, partly because a lot of this is being done slightly earlier in Britain as well. So you think about mobile photographic technology is quite limited in the sort of 1840s, 1850s, when a lot of the lines are being built, as opposed to the sort of 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, when sort of lots of lines in Europe and the sort of the Americas are being built as well. So it might be that you're missing. If the railway explosion had happened 20 years later in Britain, we might have had lots of photography of navvies. Yeah, unfortunately. But yes, no, it is a real shame actually as well, isn't it? You get the odd one or two, often for sort of navvy poets who for the frontispiece of their poetry collections, but those are often quite staged, aren't they? Sort of
they're very
done after the fact in front of a painted background with a spade slung artistically over the shoulder.
Yeah, that kind of manly image. Yeah,
yes.
Kind of natural, unposed photographs of navvies at work, quite rare.
You get occasional, as there's a lovely one that often crops up of a group of workers sort of taking a smoke break, sitting on bits of the Crystal Palace when it was being moved down to South London but that was partly because there were just loads of people there interested in photographing the Crystal Palace being reconstructed. Yeah. And so they sort of, one of them happened to take a picture of the navvies while they were having a sort of pipe break, rather than having set out there to go and capture images of navvies themselves. If I can find that image, I'll try and link it in the week.
That'd be great. Yeah. Well, I think we better wrap up, or we get too excited and our video will be 45 minutes long. But thanks very much, everyone. And I hope you enjoy the Clarks next week.
Yes.
Yeah, there's some fun material coming up there. We, like I said, we'll try and do a little wrap up for you at the end of the course.